Trapped in lockdown with your abuser, the reality of life for victims of domestic violence. Now, a cross-party group of MPs is calling for urgent action from the government to tackle the growing number of domestic abuse cases since coronavirus restrictions in movement began. In a report published today, the Home Affairs Select Committee warns that, like other countries across the world, the UK is seeing a rise in domestic violence, with calls to the abuse charity helpline run by Refuge up by 49%. Last year, the committee highlighted a shortage in beds at refuges, with 64% of referrals turned away between 2018 and 2019. And now they say the pressure is even greater. The campaign, Counting Dead Women, says that 14 women and 2 children were killed in the first 3 weeks of lockdown, double that of an average 21-day period in the last decade. Well, in a moment, we'll hear from the committee chair, Yvette Cooper, but joining me now is Rachel Williams, who was almost killed when her estranged husband shot her with a sawn-off shotgun after years of abuse. She now campaigns on behalf of victims of domestic violence. Rachel Williams, thanks very much for talking to us. What would you say from your experience is happening to women in lockdown at the moment who are living with their abuser? What will it be like?
It will be horrendous. Let's just call these perpetrators of abuse domestic terrorists, because that's what they are. Their sole purpose is to cause fear, mayhem, destruction, and to coerce their victims. So where we would normally say it's like walking on eggshells, they're going to be walking on broken glass now. It's going to be horrendous.
And it's very, very difficult, we know, for women to escape those situations in the best of times. But at the moment, there are real practical difficulties, aren't there?
Yeah, I mean, the government not doing enough. I mean, the £2 million that's been pledged, to oppose to the 66 billion it costs domestic abuse and violence, pre-COVID-19 is just an insult. It's a hollow gesture. And I think, with the shortage of beds, we know that we've only got 14,000 refuge spaces in the whole of the UK. Last year alone, we had 19,000 referrals. In Wales last year alone, we had 512 families turned away from refuge. What's it going to be like during and after COVID? And
are you hearing from women who do feel completely trapped at the moment?
Yeah, I am. I'm just a one-man bandit. I mean, last year alone, I had 738 messages via my Facebook page. This month alone, I've had 120 messages. Women finding it really increasingly hard, don't know where to turn to. I mean, the government have put out this social media campaign, that you're not alone. But they're only given half a message. You don't have to stay at home, but where do you go? They haven't followed through with their campaign. They just put a social media campaign out there with only half a message. Women want to know that they can go somewhere.
And what would you say is needed at the moment then?
I think money, that's what is needed at the moment. These services are scraping around for cash. Some of the domestic abuse services, which normally fundraise and everything else, they can't do that. We need to make sure that there's enough money in place now and after COVID.
And for women who are trapped at home, what would your message to them be?
My message would be, if you're watching this, please don't underestimate that the services are not going to come. The services are still operating. Police are making domestic abuse and violence a priority. If you're a victim and you call 999, the police will come. And if you're a perpetrator perpetrating abuse, don't think that the police are not going to come through that door, because they will.
Rachel Williams, thank you very much for talking to us. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, Labour's Yvette Cooper, who chairs the House of Commons committee which published the report in domestic violence, joins us live from London. Yvette Cooper, the evidence the committee heard paints a very bleak picture of what it is like for women and some men at the moment. Were you surprised by anything you heard?
Well, the evidence that we heard was very disturbing, and you had a very powerful interview from Rachel Williams there as well. And we had evidence of a very big increase in calls to helplines, but also a disturbing, significant increase in the number of women and children killed as a result of domestic abuse in the first few weeks of the coronavirus crisis. And that's why I think it's so urgent that we have this emergency plan in place to support services, not just a helpline. The helpline and the awareness campaign is really important, and we welcome that from the government. But there has to be a real support plan out there as well, including outreach, including safe housing guarantees, and including access to services and, crucially, funding to make sure those services are there when people need them as well.
And how likely do you think that will be delivered delivered at the moment. What are the government telling you?
Well, I hope that it will. The government has made money and funding available for charities. In theory, a lot of the refuge and domestic abuse support services could be eligible, but the real concern we have is the delay and how long it might take for them to get funding. I think it's also possible, look, if the government puts its mind to it, it can do extraordinary things in a short period of time. We've seen that. So that's why we're arguing that domestic abuse should be part of the COBRA planning process. So we should have an expansion in refuge places, but also work with local government to make sure that hotels and hostel provision is also brought online, so that in every area in the country you can be guaranteed safe housing if you are a victim of domestic abuse. And we also want to see more contact points in places like pharmacies and supermarkets, so that if people are able to get out in order to be able to seek help, there's somewhere there for them to go when they can't currently go chat to friends at the school gate.
I mean, the government have been quite clear.
Surgery.
The government have been quite clear from the outset, desperately sending out a message to any woman who might be living with an abuser: you do not have to stay there. Somewhere will be found for you to live. Are you confident that that will be the case for all women?
Well, we know that there are refuges which are full. We know that there are services that are overstretched. And of course, it's not just the housing provision. You also need all kinds of different support services, legal advice, different kind of help, especially if there are families involved. And we also need outreach. And some of the families we are most worried about are those with vulnerable children, where there's been a history of abuse, where nobody is having direct contact with those children at the moment. And we want schools and social workers and the police and other organisations to all be working together to make sure that there is face-to-face contact, including home visits, different kinds of efforts to make sure we're reaching those families rather than just letting them disappear and turning our backs on them.
Just very briefly, if you would, on the wider situation. The Prime Minister said today the lockdown is here to stay. Presumably Labour back him on that.
Labour does, Labour has. I think that we're in a situation at the moment where we have lost tens of thousands of people to coronavirus in this country in just a few short weeks. I don't think any of us have really quite come to terms with the scale of that loss and how awful that is. But I think we are calling on the government to also set out what the next steps will be, and also to publish more of the science and evidence behind it.